Hi, this is Steve Roest, and you're listening to HealthTech Hour on UK Health Radio. Each week, we give you the best news, views, and interviews from the health technology world. From CEOs and founders to entrepreneurs and clinicians. The companies and people that are shaping the future face of healthcare. All on the world's #1 talk health radio. Hello and welcome to this week's HealthTech Hour with me, Steve Roest, CEO and founder of PocDoc. Each week on HealthTech Hour, we bring you the best news, views, and interviews from the leaders, clinicians, investors, and founders who are changing the world of healthcare in the UK and beyond. As I just mentioned, I'm a HealthTech founder myself. PocDoc, who are a partner of the show, they help us put the show on, so thank you very much to them. We are revolutionizing how individuals interact with cardiovascular disease by delivering full end-to-end cardiovascular pathway, including a lipid test via a phone, which is all very exciting. And regular listeners will know how passionately I feel about increasing access to diagnostics in an affordable way. Thanks to everyone listening live on UK Health Radio. It's great to have you here on the show as ever. We wouldn't be here without you. Thanks to the UK Health Radio team for the production of the show. Also, thanks if you are downloading and listening to this on Spotify or any of the other podcast platforms. It's great to have you. Numbers going up, downloads increasing from all over the world. So thank you for that. Or YouTube, clips and full show go out every week. So we highlight the best bits and put them out on YouTube. So this week, on this week's show, we're coming back to another investor. We've had a few on the show over the last 3 or 4 months. I don't know whether that's a symptom of the way that the market is at the moment, or I'm not sure, just a coincidence. But it's always really interesting to have a blend of entrepreneur, clinician, and also investors on the show. Obviously, a lot of early stage companies that become later stage companies have to get investment from venture capitalists and other investors. It's a super important part of the ecosystem. And I think sometimes it gets overlooked, behind the headlines and things like that there are individuals and companies out there that put their hands in their pockets to fund dreams. And we have Sebastian Anastassiou from Nina Capital on the show today. So Nina Capital are a European fund, one of the leading, I would say, early stage health tech, med tech funds based in Europe. So Sebastian, welcome to the show. How are you? Thanks for having me. Yeah, I'm good. Great. I'm really pleased you joined because we were getting a little bit panicky there. But my producer was like, "Should we carry on with the show?" I said, "Yeah, let's just roll the dice. Worst case, I can talk for an hour." Yeah, it was a bit of a last minute thing, but I made it. So, Great, good. So there's a few things that I want to cover off in the show today. I think that, as I said, it's been a crazy 12 to 18 months, for the kind of the VC market. And I think Nina has a really interesting place in it. So just to start off, why don't you just explain your journey into venture capital? Let's just start there. Sure. So currently I'm a principal and head of investments at Nina Capital. I've got a background in neuroscience, so trained in neuroscience. Realized that the lab wasn't really for me, and so looking for avenues out of doing the core research, but obviously healthcare and science has always been sort of the major interest for me. So I didn't want to stray too far from that. So I dabbled a bit in life science strategy consulting in London. But then quickly moved on to technology transfer and commercialization of the biomedical research out of UCL in London as well. So I was part of UCL business. So that's essentially everything from
the earliest stage of getting healthcare research out of the lab and into the market. So that was everything from intellectual property management through to commercializing that by either licensing the technologies to pharma medtech companies who would develop it further and take it into the market, or set up startup companies with the academics and spin them off the university as the route to get these technologies into the market to actually impact patients. From there, I moved to Barcelona for the warmer weather.
It's a good decision.
Yes, no regrets. So I came here for to do an MBA at IESE Business School, and shortly after that joined Ine Capital, and I've been here now for about 2.5 years. So that's sort of how I stumbled my way into VC.
And how would you, because I mean, some people love the lab, right? I know that you left the lab. What was it about the lab and the lab environment that you didn't feel was the path that you wanted to go down?
So it was a number of things. Number one, you're stuck in a room with rats and doing experiments.
Yeah.
It's fun for a while, but it wasn't really for me. Also, you're very far away from the actual impact of the research. You can't, you may have an idea of where it may actually impact patients and the real world, but you're very, very far removed from that. And I wanted to get closer to that and actually see the impact that this research can have on patients, and actually see what happens in the real world. So that's where sort of the tech transfer came in. But even at the tech transfer stage, you're still quite far removed. It takes a very long time. Drug development or medtech development takes a long time. So you're still waiting a very long time to see the research actually enter the market and get to patients. And so I feel like I'm slowly moving closer and closer to the actual market.
I always find it funny when you see that, one of the reasons that we started the show was to give healthcare companies, healthcare founders, more of a broadcast platform, because what the missions that we're all on don't always lend themselves easily to the sort of mic drop moment of mainstream media, where you have to hit the headline, hit your message, and then they roll on to something else. And so it always makes me chuckle, because one of the things that does go very well in mainstream media are press releases about success of early stage drugs or treatments. And it makes me laugh, because mainstream media doesn't seem to quite understand how long it will be before these things actually come to pass, but they seem very, very, very keen on running a headline about blockbuster this, and it's actually, you look into it and they tested it on like 3 mice, and you're like, well, it's going to be a while before that's out.
Exactly. Even if it may not even
it may not ever come out. Yeah. And meantime, you've got businesses doing incredible things right now who can't, they just can't cut through. So that was one of the reasons why we started the show. So I thought that was kind of funny. So with what areas do you find, do you particularly find interesting? Do you focus mostly on the areas of your expertise, or are you sort of broad spectrum across everything?
So me personally, or Ine Capital?
Well, let's start with you. Let's start with you.
Sure. I mean, so obviously my neuroscience background, I naturally gravitate to anything neuroscience related. So a lot of the neuro companies that come to us, and when we're researching the space, I sort of take the lead there, as well as mental health. That's sort of.
Do you ever get frustrated where you see like companies pretending to be very neuro and technical, and then they're really not? or do you just like it's just part of it, right? Do they sometimes kind of expect you to not be a neuroscientist, and they kind of baffle you with the, you know, the biomarkers and the whatever it is, and then you're like, actually, I know what I'm talking about.
So actually, I get more of a positive response. So um, when they find out that, you know, I actually have this background and they can get as technical with me as they want, uh, they actually light up
Right.
most of the time, because they can actually they don't need to dumb down the science, and you know, a lot of the investors they speak to, they won't have a scientific background, and so they have to really, they don't get to really explain and have a in-depth conversation with
Yeah.
them as a first call. And typically the feedback I get is, you know, they like to speak to people who actually understand both the science and the market that they're trying to enter. So yeah, not really frustration from my part, but more of a positive response from the founders that I typically speak to.
Yeah, that's good. I do know myself that, you know, that it sometimes can be frustrating if you're speaking to investors who just don't understand, or just, I mean, yeah, they just don't understand any element of the science behind what you're doing. Although we have had conversations that have gone on for months with investors, and then it turns out they still don't understand what we're doing. So, you know, there might be something in what we're explaining, or the other way around. I don't know. So what do you think, just so we're all, because the listenership that we have is a very broad church. So just so we're all on the same page, sometimes VCs, venture capitalists, or anything with the word capitalist in it gets kind of labeled in the negative perspective. And there was kind of a little bit of a freak out a week or two ago with our friends Silicon Valley Bank, which I'm sure many people will be listening to, and many people realize, for many people listening, it got a bit scary about whether financial crisis was coming back again, and was this the same old, same old? So let's just go right back to the basics. Why is venture capital the life, or why do you think, or maybe you don't think, and maybe I'm crazy, but why is venture capital the lifeblood of early stage businesses, or highly innovative technology businesses, specifically healthcare and health technology businesses? And why is, assuming you think this, why is it a critical part of the ecosystem and actually massively net beneficial?
Sure. So maybe I'll start with saying that not all startups need venture capital. I know, you know, we get a lot of companies that come to us. They have a great solution, really good team, um, and the need they're solving is real. You know, it's a real need, and they can really address it. But the market just isn't that big. It's, you know,
Right.
substantial. Say it can be $100 million market, but that doesn't match. It's not congruent with what VCs need to see to invest and make their returns.
Yeah.
So, you know, a lot of companies, before they go out and speak to VCs, I would, you know, have a think about, are there other funding options that really would suit them better? I mean, can you bootstrap for, you know, as long as possible? Can you grow organically? Maybe, or, you know, it's much slower growing organically, but if you can actually fund yourself with revenue, that might be a better route for your particular company than going to VC. You know, there's angel investors out there who don't look for the same return, outsized return that VC needs to see.
And why does it need that outsized return?
So, you know, we have our own investors in our fund, and the nature of the space we invest in, which comes to, the second point of answering your question, why it's key in this startup ecosystem, is that if you look at the statistics, I can't even say a number, but the majority of startups fail. It's a very, very high risk space. And so, traditional investors, they won't invest directly into the companies because, for example, we expect 30% of our portfolio companies to be a write-off, to, return nothing. And so when you have that sort of profile of assets in a portfolio, only one or two in the whole portfolio will make the returns that our investors expect. Because it's such a high risk investment asset class, our investors will expect much higher returns than investing in the stock market or an S&P 500, for example, or other lower risk classes, investment classes. So that's why we need to have the potential to actually give our investors big returns, much better than the public markets can give. High risk, high reward, and because of the amount of failures that we expect, we need to. Every company we invest in has to have the potential. They're not all of them will do it, but they have to have the potential to return the fund, essentially, because one or two, maximum three, will actually make a difference.
So is that why, and just for the benefit of everyone listening, excuse me, there's such an obsession with market? What market are you in and how big is that market?
Exactly.
So, like an example of a market might be employee mental health, for example. Yes. The size of that market, you could argue, would be every employee in a reasonably sized business in any country. So on paper, that market looks huge, right?
Yep, absolutely. It looks huge. But if you look at the mental health market and in the employers and mental health market, it's extremely crowded.
Massively. And a pretty low barrier to entry.
Exactly. So, there's a balance here.
Yeah.
It could be a smaller market, but you're much higher barriers to entry, or much more defensible solution. You can get a larger part of the pie, a bigger piece of the pie versus a small piece of a very large pie. So these are things we have to consider. Yeah.
And sorry, carry on with what you were saying about
so
VC.
I was so because these companies are so high risk and there's such a high risk of failure, you need that's where VC comes in. They have the ability to actually invest in these extremely high risk projects, and that's sort of core, I would say. Now, different VCs have different return profiles, which means, for example, our fund, it's relatively small. It's 40 million euros. We will not need a unicorn exit typically for it to make sense.
You wouldn't say no, right?
We would not say no. We always like to see unicorn exits, of course, but we don't need to see that. We can probably return our fund with an investment that may exit at a 500 million valuation, for example. The larger VCs that have 200-300 million size funds, they will need unicorns or more to actually return 300 million from one investment. So when companies go out and seek investment, they have to understand exactly what size of VCs there are and which ones make sense for your particular company. It's
I think it's really interesting because your point that you made around whether a company should go off is relevant for venture capital. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's not a good business, and it doesn't mean you can't make a good business. I think a really relevant example, I think this is slightly changing, but in the UK, for example, traditionally, although again, I think this has shifted, but traditionally venture capital funds would not go near, or would not be interested in any business that worked with the NHS. Generally, there were exceptions. There's always exceptions, but over the last 60, 70, 80 years, there's huge numbers of companies that have been successful working with the NHS and made lots of money working with the NHS, because despite what people think, the NHS is significantly reliant on private organizations. And so, a large number of those basically had to bootstrap themselves, right? And they weren't traditional businesses that were attractive for those reasons that you just mentioned. But some of these businesses are turning over a huge amount of money now. So, it definitely, you don't need to go down that pathway, which I think is kind of interesting.
Exactly. I would I shouldn't say that. I'm a VC. We want companies to come to us, but
well, you also don't want to waste your time though, or waste their time, right?
Exactly. So I do think there's a lot of companies out there that just think of creative ways to bootstrap and do this, with other funding sources. With VC money comes a lot of strings attached. And there's certain expectations of the path that you will take over the next 5-6 years. So it's an important thing to consider.
Understood. Right. We have to stop for a short commercial break. And after that, I want to get back and I want to dig into some of the businesses, not necessarily within Nina, but just more broadly, that within healthcare that have kind of been things that you've been excited about generally. And then we can kind of come back around to why HealthTech is different potentially to other types of businesses, to the point around, can you bootstrap it? Can you not bootstrap it? There's just a limit to some of these things, given the kind of amount of upfront investment that might be required in order to get something off the ground. But we can come back after 2 minutes with Sebastian Anastassiou. Anastassiou, have I done this right?
Yeah, that's good.
It's good enough. Okay,
Greek surname. It'll work.
Okay, Sebastian Anastassiou, who's a principal at Nina Capital. We'll be right back.
The station that makes you feel good. UK Health Radio. The station that makes you feel good.
Oh, hello. I'm back. I'm so sorry. I got distracted. My producer was just waving at me. All right, we're back. This week's HealthTech Hour with me, Steve Roest, and my guest today, Sebastian Anastassiou, the principal investor from Nina Capital. So let's go into, let's actually, first of all, why don't we just tick off the issue of Silicon Valley Bank? Because many people might have seen it in the news. And in the UK, it got handled, right? Because the government basically stepped in. But for you, was this just a weird blip, or was this an indication of something more broadly wrong or difficult with, I don't know, the financial sector, the wider technology sector, or like, what's your kind of 2 minutes on Silicon Valley Bank?
Sure. So, that weekend was mayhem.
Yeah,
because it was absolute carnage. On Friday, a few of our portfolio companies were banking with them. I mean, I think half of the US venture-backed ecosystem banked with SVB, as well as some of the VCs themselves. Yeah. So the biggest problem that they had was we're worried that these companies would not be able to make payroll. Yeah. They had the money in the bank, but they couldn't touch it, and that was a big problem. So we didn't know. I didn't panic too much because there's just too much riding on this. So the governments would have to step in, and so on Sunday some of our companies had emergency board meetings to see what we should do.
But then imagine how that just was not much fun.
No, but then come Monday, at least all the startups had access to their money. Got it all out into other banks. and everything's fine now, really. I would say for the startups.
But is this? I mean, like, was it just a weird? It's just. I mean, it's.
Well, I
What
mean,
like?
so you're seeing, I mean, you saw Credit
Where
Suisse,
Credit Suisse, yeah,
right? I think First Republic as well.
to be fair to Credit Suisse, they've had problems for years and years.
Yes.
That's not a new thing, but it got bad quick.
Yeah, so I'm not an economist.
No,
I'm not an investment banker, so I'm not the best person to comment on the wider markets here. I am I do think what this does, a learning here is not to put all your eggs in one basket.
definitely not.
So
I would
spread,
agree with that.
to all the companies out there, spread your cash around
Yeah.
a couple of banks at least. Even though, this is I would say it's a weird blip. It's not
Let's
a normal
hope.
thing.
I think it's unhelpful though. So like if you're out raising money right now, it's not going to help the market sentiment, even though if you didn't have anything to do with SVP.
Yes.
It just increases the nervousness, right?
I guess, but if you go for, if you're a smart investor, it shouldn't scare you.
No,
It shouldn't
that's
scare
right.
you. I think the investors that are most affected are the ones that had SVB as an investor themselves. So, SVB had a fund of funds, and they were
Oh, did it? I didn't know
yes,
that.
it's slightly separate. I don't know I'm not going to go into detail into the structure. They were
Sure.
separate, and they're trying to sell that off now. But they were investors of funds, and they typically took large,
Right.
they're sometimes anchor investors. And so those funds are probably trying to work out what's next, and they
Yeah,
may be a bit more hesitant to invest right now.
that makes sense.
But that's not the majority.
Sure.
So yeah.
Okay, so let's switch it up and let's talk about, and you can talk about Nina Capital's portfolio, but you don't have to be loyal. You can talk about other stuff as well. But what are the kind of like, let's go through two or three companies that you think, or areas, or different types of industries right now within health technology that you think are super exciting or super interesting, and maybe stuff that people wouldn't necessarily immediately think about.
Right.
Not to
So
put you on the spot, but
yeah, I'll have a think and hopefully come up with something interesting. So maybe I'll take a step back and just explain where, what our investment thesis is.
yeah, Nina, yeah.
So as you know, we are healthcare focused investors. But we invest at the intersection of health and technology. So we don't do traditional drugs,
Yeah.
pure biotech. It's really a lot of pure software plays, can be medtech hardware, um, regulated medical devices, unregulated healthcare tools.
Mm-hmm.
So we're quite broad in the health technology space, but hyper focused in that we're only in health tech. Now, we have a bias towards data. So we do think data-driven solutions are there's going to be, and we've already seen a lot of interesting companies built from data. And so one of our theses, and we have a bunch of mini portfolios within our whole portfolio, is something we call data liquidity.
Okay.
And so that's everything to do with the movement of data, the utilization of health data, how to actually unlock data for healthcare for healthcare purposes. And so we've looked at that from various angles. So we've made one investment in the US called SegMed, and they're essentially partnering with data providers, hospitals and other healthcare providers that produce for example, healthcare imaging data.
Okay.
And what they do, they have a technology to basically de-identify and create, enable those data sets to be shared and used by researchers to develop, for example, AI solutions for diagnostics and everything. And that's a huge issue. It's the actual de-identification, the privacy. Privacy is such an important thing when it comes to healthcare data.
Yeah.
And so, this company focuses on this, and I think people underestimate that for health tech solutions to really make an impact and really, really work, you need access to this data. And so there needs to be a balance between, 100% privacy and enabling, interesting startups access to that data. And, we found that this company enables that. So it's all about dealing with that privacy aspect, de-identification of the data.
And which I guess unlocks value for a huge number of other people, right? Because there are lots and tons and tons of businesses that have very advanced AI and analytics, diagnostics, but if you don't have the data sets to run through it, then you can't do anything.
Exactly. And you did say something that's not obvious, but I'll mention GPT-3 from and you're seeing Microsoft and Google essentially going head to head now. I think Google just announced that they've released this thing called Open Health Stack, I think it's called, where essentially it's a bunch of open source building block tools for health tech developers to essentially use.
Wow.
So they're really and they're always looking for data to essentially build these foundational models essentially that entrepreneurs and startups can hopefully use to develop really, really interesting and impactful solutions out there. And I think this is a space I'm really, really following closely. We'll see how Microsoft and Google will fight for this. I think.
And then you see what Amazon's going to do. I mean, AWS is not just going to sit there not doing anything.
Exactly. So Amazon is the next player. There's going to be this. I think it's going to be an interesting time for health tech startups to essentially partner with the likes of Microsoft, Google, or Amazon.
If you're a data business, an AI, if you're in health tech, healthcare, but your sort of core stack is around data, anything that crosses over with them, I think it's going to be super interesting as to whether you can partner to develop more value or whether they just eat your market.
Well, so this is I'm really and I don't know what's going to happen.
You don't know how it's going to go.
But I'm really thinking about this, but they are showing signals that obviously Google, they are developing their own algorithms. Some for example, diagnostics for breast cancer using ultrasound images. But if you look at the partnerships they're doing, it's mostly with non-profits. A couple of the Google partnerships, they're focused on Africa and African hospitals as well. So and also these large companies, they're slow. This is where
and they're also risk averse, right? I mean, they're not, and they're very, very. They're very averse to proceeding through a regulatory pathway generally, right? They don't like that. They don't like showing people they're working. They don't like having to submit technical dossiers or doing any of that stuff. That's just not really in their DNA. They're like, we'll build stuff. People are going to use it. Just leave us alone. That's sort of what the ethos.
And so that's where I see the signals going. They are they're developing these foundational AI models, which are essentially just trained on masses and masses of unstructured data, and then those can be then used by health tech companies to build actual products. So as opposed to the technology, there's a difference between the technology, underlying technology, and building blocks, and then building a product. So that's where these tech companies, these health tech companies, can really get an edge. Is building on everything that Google, Microsoft, and
sort of like
Amazon are doing.
It's sort of like AI as a service, right? It's kind of like they'll make their models available to you to then use to develop a product service that you then take on, but it's sort of like their core algorithm or whatever it is at the heart of it, basically. So it does some of the work for you.
Because ultimately they want you to be on their cloud services and their cloud platform, and that's where they'll make their money.
Yeah, they benefit from you. They benefit from you building your service on them. I would imagine they would much prefer to be able to power 100 startups trying to improve breast cancer diagnosis from ultrasound than be the one that goes to the NHS to try and sell in their own service, right? I guess.
Well,
right?
That's my thesis. That's my thesis, but we'll see. You can't predict the future, so
no.
But yeah, it's an interesting space.
I think this like information as a service, analytics as a service, like AI as a service, I think is really interesting, and it will be really interesting because obviously there's lots and lots of companies out there around scan analysis, improved diagnostics using AI, MRI, ultrasound, all of that kind of stuff. And I think it's going to be really interesting as to whether what Google and Microsoft and potentially Amazon do, whether it's like net supportive or net competitive or kind of a bit of both.
Exactly.
It's hard to see right now.
Yeah. I 100% agree. And then the other sort of thing that I'm quite interested in right now is in synthetic data. So that's essentially it's a form of generative AI. I'm not an expert in the technical side of things here, but essentially they take real world data and then build models to generate fake data that is essentially identical in terms of the statistical properties and things that can be then used by AI developers to actually train and fine-tune there are many different fine-tune their algorithms.
And they do that because there's not enough existing underlying data to do it.
So I mean, there are two things here. There could be privacy. So if you do this, then you're not actually sharing the real data. But also it can be used for cases where there isn't that much data. So, very, very rare conditions that, I don't know. There's a certain lung condition where there's very little data and you could actually generate images that replicate that and can be used for AI algorithm development.
Right.
Sense.
That's cool.
As well as health equity as well. I mean, so when I say health equity, I mean access to marginalized demographics that aren't as represented in the data sets that are used to train algorithms.
Right.
And this is a huge problem, which is...
That makes sense. It's a bit like a much more advanced issue around how women weren't included in clinical trials for goodness knows however long. But that's an even more advanced version of that, where the ethnic breakdown of images that are currently existing to be used for this training don't represent reality.
Exactly. So, and obviously it was early days, but this is something that's very interesting. We made one investment in that a couple of years ago that was acquired by another company 1 year ago, and that was focused on text data, so data sets essentially. And we've recently made an investment in a German startup, very, very young, great team that are focused on the imaging side. So basically generating synthetic, for example, CT scans. And that's extremely difficult to do. But with generative AI and seeing how this is progressing. I think this is an interesting space. One of these places we've invested where it's very difficult to see what the future holds, but something cool will happen within that space.
Yeah.
So
that's really cool. I hadn't heard of that before. That's awesome. There's just a lot of stuff, and this is what I mean about, there are obviously things like ChatGPT get loads of headlines, right? But things like this actually stand to make a huge difference within healthcare, and it's not like they're that well known necessarily. I would say something like data liquidity is probably a bit more known than synthetic data generation, but I think they're still not necessarily on everyone's agenda, and I think that's super, super interesting. We have to go for our last break now. So we'll be back in 2 minutes for the last part of this week's HealthTech Hour with Sebastian Anastassiou, the principal lead investor from Nina Capital. We'll be right back.
UK Health Radio, the station that makes you feel good. UK Health Radio, the station that makes you feel good.
Hello and welcome back to the final part of this week's HealthTech Hour with me, Steve Roest, CEO of PocDoc, and my guest today, Sebastian Anastassiou, the principal investor from Nina Capital. So before the break, we were talking about a couple of really cool developing areas, synthetic data, data liquidity. Is there anything else that's on your agenda that may be slightly unusual? What about tech bio? Have you heard? Are you biotech or tech bio? What's your preference? I love the way that jargon just gets inverted because we can't come up with something new. But anyway,
so what's your definition of
my
tech
definition
bio?
of tech bio? That's a great shout. So we had Jason C. Foster from Ori Biotech on the show a couple of months ago. He's someone that has been really helpful to me and us in our journey at PocDoc. And I guess my definition of it, not that I'm a particular expert in it, but the way I would sort of define it is that there are a number of treatments that involve biological processes in order to generate that treatment, where the clinical data is extremely clear as to the efficacy of those treatments. The clinical efficacy is not new. It's been around for a while, and these treatments are highly effective in doing what they want to do, doing in their intended target, and like CAR T-cell therapy. But the actual production of that treatment is prohibitively expensive. And so it's either not used or it's used in a fourth or a fifth line in the case of CAR T-cell therapy, which means that it moves from a kind of a potential cure to being used when someone's actually quite a lot sicker than when they might have been if you'd have used it as a first line. But you can't use it as a first line because it's $2 million or something per treatment. And so the whole purpose of tech bio is to take these biologically based treatments and dramatically decrease cost through dramatically optimized, improved production and manufacturing. So I think it's a really interesting area because they're not, what is really helpful, I think, and quite exciting is you're not trying to reinvent the wheel with seeking clinical approval or clinical efficacy. Like that's done, like that argument's done. What you're trying to do is apply production, manufacturing, scale up to a really, really hard thing to scale up, right? Like in CAR T-cell therapy, where you're stripping someone's T-cells out, reprogramming them, mass producing them, then re-injecting them. And it's every single person is exactly this, is a complete repeat. So how do you scale that up? I think but if you can, then, and it moves to a first line or a second line, then the possible impact on certain types of cancer is like transformative. So that's how I think about it. But am I wrong?
No, and I 100% agree. I mean, even before my time at Nina Capital, at UCL, we had a few spin-out companies. One Autolus Therapeutics, CAR T-cell therapy for oncology. a few others. So I've I've sort of been involved in this for a while, and with these, whenever you see these innovative therapeutics come out, they will always come before before any manufacturing technologies.
What people don't realize is sometimes they're run off of really small batch data.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely.
Like talking like hundreds of people, not thousands, maybe less.
Yep. And you can talk about gene therapies as well.
Yep.
In the same vein. Now, at Nina Capital, we 100% agree with you, and we've actually invested in a company out of Austria called Sarcura.
Okay.
And essentially, they are doing exactly this. They are developing technology to automate the manufacturing process of cell therapies.
Right.
And this is one of the deeper tech investments that we have made.
Yeah.
And we're very excited to see what happens in this space, because the impact that cell therapies can have in treating these diseases, you need these companies to actually make it feasible for hospitals to actually administer
health systems. You need exactly. It's when I got more into talking to Jason about it, it's not I've been really busy building PocDoc, so it's not really been something I've paid a huge amount of attention to. But when he was explaining it to me, I was like, this makes so much sense. Like, I'm not saying you're going to crack it, right? I don't know. There's a huge amount of technical risk, but cracking it has to be a priority for somebody to fund somewhere.
Exactly. No, absolutely. And so, we're backing this company, and hopefully, I'm confident they'll do well. That it's an interesting space as well when you talk to the different stakeholders. So, if you speak to a lot of physicians, they, and this is I'm generalizing here, but they have a vision of developing, or rather having these machines at the hospital, and they essentially manufacture the actual cell therapies
at the point of care.
At the point of care, exactly. Point of care manufacturing,
box or something.
Exactly, and then that's a big vision that a lot of physicians in this space that I've spoken to seem to think things are going. If you speak to the cell therapy companies, they do not see this happening, at least in the near future, because the regulatory barriers for that hospitals will need to have all it's
because they're manufacturing a drug on premise.
Exactly. Right? And this isn't a small molecule pill. These are cell therapies, highly complex. You're going
to need a highly controlled environment and all
exactly. So there's interesting discussions of where we see which stakeholder will take. Which stakeholder will have which part of the whole pipeline here, and where the manufacturers come in. So a big problem for these manufacturing technologies, for example, Sarcura and Ori Biotech, is how do the regulatory bodies view regulatory approval of the cell therapies? If they've been approved through the process, through the use of one manufacturing method, how will they adopt this new manufacturing technology, a new manufacturing process, without having to go through an arduous regulatory approval again?
I spoke to Jason about that thing, and also the idea that, so when you manufacture a drug or a medical device, or there's a huge amount of emphasis, rightly, placed on repeatability, consistency, quality control. batch control, all of these different, checks and balances, right?
Yep.
So that what comes out at the end is what you think it is, and it will, if used properly, will perform in the manner that you have approval for, and is safe and all those kind of things. That's easier when you have one compound that's a stable compound that you can QC in the middle or QC at the end, and you understand, or a device, and it's, it either does it or it doesn't do it. But if you've got each individual's T cell therapy will by definition be unique. So how do you QC that in a way that's and the thing is, I'm sure that smart people sat around a table, probably the people at this either the Ori Biotechs or the cell therapy companies, they can figure it out. My concern is whether they can get it to the regulators to come with them on what will. I'm sure there is a solution that will mean it will be safe, but whether that fits the definition that the regulators have of where they see this, I don't know, because this is sort of 2 steps further ahead in the pathway, and particularly to your point, theoretically, if you change the manufacturing process, you certainly would have to do what's called an equivalence.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, which for something like this, I could imagine being quite arduous, I suspect.
Yeah.
It's not going to be small potatoes.
Exactly. But it has to happen. I think the Ori Biotechs, the Sarkoras,
you can cure certain types of cancer if you use it in a first line or a second line. The efficacy is off the charts for CAR T cell therapy, right?
Absolutely. And I guess the next step for them is autologous cell therapy, so where you don't need to use the actual cells from the individuals. You can actually have blank canvases essentially, and then use those to. I'm not an expert in this.
Well, no, but if you get who knows? But if you get to that, then that solves a lot of the manufacturing issues.
Exactly.
I could, without knowing anything about the science and whatever, I could see that being where the solution ultimately lies if it's feasible.
Yeah.
Because then that can give you some element of consistency or baselining or something. That would be really cool.
Yeah.
So got a few minutes left in the show. You've spoken a few times around the fact that Nina Capital comes in early, likes to invest early. And so I suspect that a big part of your decision making is on the team.
Absolutely.
So what are the qualities? What's a good team versus not a good team? And what do you like to see? And what's a red flag to you? And I think it'd just be helpful for anyone who is an entrepreneur already, or starting a company, or thinking about starting a company, let's hear it directly from you about that, because particularly that early stage, the founding team, and then the first hires around in the founding team, that's really important.
Sure, absolutely, and it's the first sort of item of our checklist when we analyze companies. So obviously, a lot of it is you can't even define. So it's very much you speak to them and you get a feel for their personalities and how they work and all of this. Now, leaving that aside, what we really look for are diverse teams. Now, I'm not talking about gender diversity, ethnic diversity. That's very important as well. But when I talk about diversity, I mean it in the complete sense. So diversity in backgrounds. You could be fully diverse in gender and ethnicities, but your 3 co-founders from MIT,
right,
and with a mechanical engineering PhD, all 3 of you, that's not a diverse team. The best teams are these interdisciplinary teams that essentially have different backgrounds and they complement each other's in each other's gaps in knowledge and experience, essentially. So that's sort of very important. And the second thing I want to get across is the extended team. So we don't only look at the core team, very important, but have they been able to attract key advisors. These are key opinion leaders in the space. They're ex entrepreneurs. They have years of experience that can either mentor them or give them the advice or the right connections to essentially help them build a really strong company. Now that not only tells us that they have the ability to convince very busy people that they have a great company and actually convince them to come on board. But also it shows that they have the extended support to actually really do what they need to do. It's hard to start a business and grow it. With a team of 3 co-founders, you can do amazing things. If you add a team of 3 or 4 really key advisors that can help, that's a huge plus when we analyze companies. So I encourage any startups out there, really think about building a really, really good extended team, as well as the core team and all the other hires.
And quickly before we go, we've got like 1 minute. Beyond the diversity, what would you say across the companies that you've worked with or alongside or however, what are the key qualities that the founders have in businesses that are doing well or have done well, or however? It doesn't mean about exit, but more like what are the consistent qualities from good founders?
It's a very tough question to answer.
You've got about 45 seconds. So.
Right. So I would say ability to adapt to the situations, i.e., how fast can you learn and how fast can you use those learnings to your benefit. I think that's sort of the number one quality I've seen that makes a founder and a team of founders really, really strong. Do they listen to the market? Do customers say this and then they act on it, and they can either pivot or make certain changes to actually listen to what their advisors say and what their customers say.